All right, welcome back to Four Elements Press. This is Alex Casillas, and today I'm with Angelica Martinez, and we're going to be doing a little bit of a answer the questions from an editor video about my second book, Lost Between the Lands of Here and There. With the first one, Sunset in the Valley of Now and Then, we've done previous interviews before, so you can check those out. And today we'll be talking about our or my Mediterranean adventure. Angelica is editor on this book and also the primary reader, or the first reader of all of the new ideas and storylines and characters that I brought into the Immortal Philosophers. And yeah, welcome to the channel, Angelica.
Thank you for having me. So, what inspired you to write this book as your second one?
So with this second book, it does take Dylan and Antonio from the Jersey Shore on into Malaga, a city on the coast of Spain along the Mediterranean. And the setting was a little bit inspired from my travels there. I spent a little over a week there a few years ago, and I was really struck by the architecture, the history, and the different stories I was learning about some of the places and people that we um, encountered. So, with Marcus Aurelius also being a main character in the story, him being the leader of the Immortal Philosophers, I found it really nice to connect some of the history of Malaga with the history of the Immortal Philosophers in general for that city in particular and one building, the Palacio de Asturias, to be the headquarters of the Immortal Philosophers. And in as you start reading, you kind of meet some characters that let you understand why it is the headquarters. Um, One like the architect of the building, who is long deceased but immortal in this book, is kind of the steward of the headquarters still. Um, and some of the other characters kind of who might have lived in the US or started their life in the US and moved to Europe all kind of gravitate to this place under the guidance of Marcus Aurelius, but all still with their own stories and their own characters and their own like relationships within the group. Um, so I wanted Dylan to learn to meet some of these other figures in the group, to be challenged by them as a new immortal, to like expand his powers, but also come to terms with what it means to be an immortal and have these other examples rather than just Marcus Aurelius or the Ocean City Immortals who he spent the summer with. Um, because as we learn quickly on in the book, Europe is more of a battleground for the immortals versus the predators, whereas in the US the dynamic is a little bit different. The immortals are kind of underground and hidden, and the predators also kind of uh, have that same presence where the immortals have to really work to uncover them and then stop them. Whereas in Europe, the predators are kind of like dominant, and the immortals are kind of always having to hide. Um, And then there's a whole plot that is a little bit alluded to in the beginning of book one, or not the beginning, but the middle, where Antonio is talking about Aurelius coming to Ocean City and um, him being so busy in Europe and then him having to return right after their ultimate like battle with Joshua. So this is the continuation of what Aurelius has been doing over in Europe and in Spain, in Malaga particular. And then the Predators plan is kind of in full force by the time Dylan and Antonio get there. They're almost kind of like plan B, C, or D in Aurelius's plan to stop the Predators plot. So they have to quickly get up to speed and they quickly get in the action of what's going on. Um, yeah, so that was the initial inspiration. And then as I introduced all of these characters, the Immortals and the Predators, the new ones that we meet, they kind of carried the trajectory of where the story eventually goes.
So, what was your method in deciding which philosophers to include as the Immortal Philosopher group? Um, because you have quite a few characters. It's like a cast almost of new people that you're meeting. So, what helped you narrow down which ones to include and which ones to save for another series of books?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Um, the Immortals that I included were people from history that I knew about. Either that I have read a lot of works by with understanding of their own internal philosophies and how they conducted themselves in the world when, they were alive and not in my fictional dreams. Um, and also, I wanted to include many characters who, because it's like a gay centered series, who were also queer or like
Like,
suspected to be queer.
yeah, like James Baldwin, right?
Yeah, like James Baldwin is one of those uh historical figures and characters who was a gay man. Um his fiction revolved around like many different themes, but the gay story was one of them and the gay life. And characters like Gertrude Stein, who also had a wife, but we're not really always taught that part of their life in school and college or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, we just kind of learn what their contributions to maybe literature were. Um, and then characters who had and then like Edgar Hoover as a predator, as one of the worst people in like human history too. In particular towards minorities, women in America, queer people in America, with even the suspicion of him being a queer person himself, and specifically also to Puerto Rican people who, um, that's a culture I share, and Antonio is another Puerto Rican character. And the trajectory that I have for the series in general, his kind of Hoover's plots kind of align with, um, are going to be kind of the driving force in the series moving forward, stopping his plots. And even though Hoover kind of makes an appearance in the beginning of this book, he's not the main focused villain of the plot that the Immortals are trying to thwart. Um, whereas he does become more of a central figure in book three. So in book two, he's kind of like the puppet master commanding these other predators that he has leverage over. Um, as they're carrying out part of his plan while he's kind of sitting in Malaga carrying out his ultimate goal. So stopping some of those other characters becomes a central plot in Dylan's story. And there are characters that I wanted to create also. So, like, Elliot is the world famous pop star. And then Jordy Portendorfer is another one of those kind of characters based off of maybe what makes a historically relevant person in the 21st century. So, it might not be famous poets or literary heads. It's like pop stars. It's like Jordy is a bro podcaster. So it's like bringing in these different parts of our culture and diving into them a little bit deeper than the surface level to show like almost the kind of predatory nature of these figures. Um, no matter how they depict themselves, even like Elliot is kind of like that pure hearted pop star, really cares about his fans, really wants to feel loved by people.
And who
Um,
gets taken advantage of by the people behind him.
yeah, he gets taken advantage of. He also is kind of like has a spoiled-ish kind of mindset and a little bit brash and leaves a bad taste in the characters' mouths. But he also has been so deprived of like that love from the people closest to him that um under the Predator's guidance, he was kind of mirroring their own disdain for him. And then as he quickly becomes under the guidance of the Immortals, he starts to kind of feel like he can trust people and like he can be vulnerable to people, not just his fans and through his music, but he also has this like immortal auric energy that is very like attractive to people. So be the reason like why he was be able to become this world famous pop star is because in part not only the music but his aura is infectious and as he sings it enchants people in the audience. So it also kind of plays on like that real life experience of like being captivated as a fan by someone who you just feel like not attracted to in a like sexual sense, but attracted to maybe the energy they give off, the what they put in their music, how they conduct themselves in like a idol kind of way.
Hmm.
Um, and there's also some other forces at play that, nobody really knows about until like the very end, that go into a lot of his behavior and a lot of the dynamic between Dylan, Elliot, and Antonio. Um, because they're also like the three youngest immortals.
Yes. And
They,
they're, oh, sorry, go
no,
ahead.
you're good.
And they're also in a love triangle because Elliot kind of hits on, well, both Dylan and, um, oh my goodness, I'm blanking out on
Antonio.
Antonio. Thank you so much. Antonio's like couplishness, and he's like trying to get in between them, but not necessarily to break them up, but just because, like, as you said, he wants that love for himself, and it kind of complicates things between Antonio and Dylan. So what
Yeah.
inspired you to bring that into this book?
Yeah, so
Mm.
in from like the writer's perspective, you always have to be considering like what is the conflict, the central conflict, not only driving the plot, but also driving the decisions and the conflicts of the main character. So, in a story and in a series where there's a dozen new characters, right? Or more, there's a cross Mediterranean journey and like concert um going on, and that's the plot, right? Um the immortals have to stop the predators. There's a lot of opportunity for the writer to lose that central conflict of what's at stake for the individual main character. In a version where I would have Elliot not complicate, not be so selfish and not complicate the relationship between Dylan and Antonio, and also to not really want anything, um, it would kind of make Elliot, and just for Elliot to accept everything, it would make Elliot feel a little flat and kind of like a pawn.
Yeah.
It would also make Dylan kind of feel like a pawn, even if he was tasked with maybe training Elliot or being like a leader for Elliot in this new stage of what he has to be as an immortal philosopher. Like, okay, now you're a teacher too. Which Aurelius tasks Dylan with taking Elliot under his wing, but Elliot is just so in his own world and in his own desire and perspective that he doesn't have that filter in terms of not getting what he wants or having to dance around in a manipulative way, maybe, or like in a covert way of trying to get what he wants. He just says it, he just does it. And Dylan wanting to be an immortal philosopher who can handle a mission and who can succeed at everything because Dylan's like a perfectionist. He's a perfectionist with his book covers that he designs in book one. He is even like a perfectionist in the way that he views how he wants love. He doesn't want kind of just like cheap love or cheap lust or whatever else he can find out there. He wants something meaningful. And he finds that in Antonio in book one. And he has that with Antonio in book two. In the beginning, there's a beautiful scene where they get dinner on his birthday in Malaga, and the city really comes to life around him, and he's just enchanted by the city. He's enchanted by the love that he never really imagined what could be real. So Elliot kind of coming in and crashing that becomes a lot of that central conflict for Dylan to the point where with the complexity of everything going on and the relationships that he has to make, he wants to get along with all of the immortal philosophers. All the new ones that he's meeting, they all really care about Antonio. Um, and Elliot makes it clear to everyone kind of his intention with Dylan. So there becomes a lot of conflict between Dylan and Elliot because Dylan's like trying to do this balancing act between him and like his love for Antonio, Elliot's like dominating presence in what he has to do now for the immortals to make Aurelius happy, and then also in having smooth relationships with these other immortals who make it clear to him like if you break Antonio's heart, we're gonna like you're gonna have to deal with us. So his balancing act of all these different strings is it drives us all the way through the book to the end, until there is like a resolution and a perspective of like what really was going on and driving all these behaviors. Um, and so from the writer perspective, that was the main driver in how do I get this character? How do I get this story to center around this character and this character's wants, but also have all the other characters be wanting something too? And Dylan struggles throughout the book, but he makes some real breakthroughs too in his understanding of and these scenes also offer the reader understandings of what love looks like in an immortal world or in with immortal characters and what love could also mean for humanity in terms of there's one scene where Dylan is having a conversation with um Cleo Selene and who is based off of the historical queen Cleopatra Selene of Mauritania, and her husband's also in the book King Juba II, as an immortal, and they all kind of have their own different lores about them. Like she's like a moon queen. There's lore behind her um, birth or death. Just off the top of my head, I can't remember. Being like on some kind of significant moon um, lunar day. And then her husband was really influential in like sea trade. So like he has like an affinity for like powers over the tides and stuff like that. Um, and Queen Moremi also another African queen who is also kind of tied to mythological lore, which plays into the story, but also um, her affinity for the moon is kind of symbolic, but also influential in the story because her and Cleo Selene have this kind of like moon queen bond, and they're like they have a lot of care for each other, not only as immortals, but like they both have the same energy color, aura color, and they both have these like moon side meditations where they kind of absorb the energy of the moon.
Yeah, it is interesting to look at like the mythology that inspired these characters because kind of reminds me of like Percy Jackson with like the Greek gods and kind of gives them superpowers in a way. Um
Yeah. But
and
also I wanted to kind of talk about how when Dylan's having this conversation with Cleo Selene,
yes.
they really go through all the different things that could be at play in terms of like life and life trajectory and love, and in terms of bringing in like astrology and nature and the cycles of hundreds of years of life, and like how biologically the body will still go through different cycles of wanting, maybe like wanting a family or wanting, solitude or other things like this. And how sometimes maybe a couple isn't always on that same path together. So, how they always kind of like have to respect their own individuality, but also not allow that to compromise the bonds that they do have, like with her husband. And to understand those things and then to make decisions based off of all of that together. Um, so like Dylan, it's his first relationship. He's really learning and getting different perspectives. It's his first life too. So
Mm-hmm.
his perspective is not as like broad or like all knowing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but he gives tolerance to all these different ways of thought and um, kind of allows the reader, without like telling the reader, um, to explore these different aspects of like life and love and immortality, um, even if Dylan is still struggling with it every day. And like maybe some conversations help, but they don't at the same time because it's just like, well, just give me an answer and tell me what to do. Don't make me have to do it myself, you know?
Yeah, and I noticed with Cleo Selene, is how you
Yeah.
say her name. She kind of speaks in a very circular way, which kind of reminds me of the moon because it's a circle. So I
Mm.
thought that was interesting as well. Um, if okay, what would you hope readers take away from your book? This book specifically.
Yes, so I like that question, and I think that's something that I really came upon through letting the characters and the story get to where it was going. Um, and then me understanding more of what these characters were telling me. Um, and that's also not directly related to just Dylan. Like Dylan's story is the dominating storyline, but what the reader really learns at the end is, and what I kind of took away from it is there's this sense of ownership and like of collecting and of attachments and of collecting of knowledge and of experiences and of like the greatest things in humanity, whether that be like people or treasures or whatever, or power and control. So at the end, I don't really want to like spoil the turning point, like of where the true book really ends, but there is a character at the end, and the end isn't even like where you kind of expect it to be at. Um, like none of the characters understand really where the story will end in terms of how it actually ends. So hold on for that plot twist, but um, because it comes into like a whole second plot of like a whole overarching plot that was always there, but like nobody knew it was there. Um, so the character at the end really shows us that, and even like in a meta way of like me, like writing these characters that I think kind of show a lot of or teach us a lot about humanity in general, to collect them all into this book is like the main character at the end is kind of like not Dylan, but the is kind of like a meta version of like what I was doing in book two. Like you can create the perfect cast, you can collect every um greatest thinker or greatest figure of humanity and put them all in this place where they might be living without any needs because all their needs could be met, or they could just have no purpose other than being able to kind of live in their own thoughts without struggle. And not to say like, make people struggle in the worst ways, but when you're in like a perfect place and there is no purpose, what do the greatest thinkers and greatest minds and greatest figures do? Um, other than how they interact with each other for like a common goal. So like the immortals in the immortal philosophers all have this goal, and like the goal of like stopping the predators and protecting humanity and the mortals, um, and keeping them from being taken advantage of and, killed and all that kind of stuff. But if you take them out of the world and take them out of their own reason for being there, because these immortals also struggle with, there's always going to be a predator to go up against. So is it just this endless cycle of trying so hard to only have to keep trying so hard? And like, yeah, that's what keeps them going and kind of what gives their life purpose. But if there is no antagonist, then what really is the story? What's the goal? What's the satisfaction? And like, what is the greatness? Um, it kind of can fall into just kind of purposelessness where you can be unhappy in terms of not being fulfilled in your mission. So that's kind of like what I hope people can take out of this book is find like your passion for living, um, and make that your mission and work at it and strive into like success, hopefully, right? Because just being a collector or just being someone who um wants like control or things like that, to say like what can these people offer me, offer something to everyone else, because that is where true greatness really lies. And that's the lesson that Dylan has a great way of portraying to the like main biggest antagonist at the end of book two. Um, and sometimes it's also not always like a battle or a finishing of a battle in terms of a physical way that could be as powerful as just getting across the flaws in the logic,
Mm-hmm.
um, that drive individuals, that they can no longer hold on to after you kind of break it down in their own heads in a way.
And something I noticed, aside from the obvious, the difference between the predators and the immortal philosophers, is the immortal philosophers kind of go by this philosophy of what we owe to each other and kind of doing things because it's the right thing to do, not necessarily because they'll get something out of it, like you were saying. Like it's not all about gaining, like with the predators, what do I gain from this? Where, what do I get out of it? Um, so I appreciate that message because I feel like sometimes, especially in individualist societies, we kind of focus on the self, like what are my needs and how can I get them met? But it's often about community and what we do for each other that really sets us apart. Okay, let me
Yeah,
look.
and even like the immortals are immortal, but they go into every battle planning on giving it their all, and they're sacrificing. Like they can be killed. Their soul might be, transcended into a different body, or they might be born again into a different body, or um have to kind of like sh be tortured through the process of like rebuilding if their body's like salvageable by their aura,
Yeah.
which can take years too. So like and then they're away from their like loved ones who are the other immortals. They're um like they go in knowing that it's going to be a struggle and knowing that they're making a sacrifice for something bigger than themselves. Whereas, yeah, the predators really do like it's what can I get out of it? How can I stab someone else's back? And um, I might believe in this overall mission, but like I'm doing it because like I believe in this evilness and like they need the evilness to survive.
Mm-hmm.
They're like parasites in a way. Like they have to keep being evil to persist. Um, Whereas the immortals, they don't need to help people for them to keep living. They can go off on an island and live by themselves and let the predators do whatever they want, but they really make this conscious effort to use their gift not only for themselves but for others, and that is like a major difference. And it's an inspiring difference, even in this story, um, to some of the figures at the end, and even to Elliot himself, as he kind of shifts his own perspectives. And then also, there's like a shock factor where, and like a reasoned shock factor kind of towards the end where the big shift happens, the big plot twist happens, where the immortal philosophers are just in awe that like um, a driving figure in the plot can be in such a way or be reasoned into such a way to kind of compromise all of their own existences too.
So going into more technical question, did you use a functional outline or was it just chaos that somehow worked as you were working on this book?
So I knew where I wanted it to go. I didn't use like an outline. What I do sometimes though is as I'm writing into the chapters, I'll kind of know where the next chapter is going. So I'll put like a title for that chapter and then figure it out. So like, and then also like rereading the chapters that I've previously written and then kind of knowing where, okay, so if we're getting here in like 3 or 5 chapters, something, but like I know that plot twist is coming and there needs to be some breadcrumbs. Um, the beginning of this chapter is going to be that breadcrumb. The struggle of it is going to be an immediate struggle that they're going to have to overcome before they get to the next destination. Um, so like you can notice some of the chapters between the concerts, the different concerts,
Mm-hmm.
uh, kind of have that vibe. Um, because I didn't want it to also just be a bouncing between concert locations, because I felt like it could kind of get pretty redundant.
Mm-hmm.
Because the setting is still like the Mediterranean, so it's like it's a beach. It's on the beach or it's at the docks. It can get kind of redundant for readers to just bounce around between like different beachside locations. Even if they are all distinct, I didn't really want them to get because they're on the ship for a lot of it too. So even like going back to the ship and being on the ship, each chapter has its own distinct flavor. Uh, and then there's breakdowns of like, okay, this chapter is about Dylan working with Leibniz about expanding his own power because he's still training to be stronger and stronger and stronger. So it's like he's still has his own trajectory in terms of his training, in terms of his relationships with these people. So each chapter has its own flavor. And I wanted to make sure there was a good balance between all of them, so that Dylan's always being challenged, always changing, and then the reader is getting like all of those little boxes like satisfied as the story goes along. Um, and then really like no matter where the story goes, my main question is always what is Dylan being challenged in at this moment? Because it's written from his perspective. Um, and to keep the reader invested in his journey without it feeling like he's just along for the ride, there has to be all these different like facets of his life at play, especially with like Antonio kind of avoiding him for a lot of the book.
Hmm.
Um, and that was a decision, maybe not a decision I made because I was always looking for how they would come back together. Um, but how it played out kind of felt right in the course of both of their like learnings. So like there is opportunity for Antonio and Elliot to kind of be forced to work together without Dylan there. So it allows Dylan to kind of get closer to other characters, to learn, to change, or get some inklings of how to change or how to balance everything. And then, yeah, so vaguely outlined, but still driven by Dylan's narrative in terms of how things got to where they were going. Um, because I feel like that's the strongest way to tell a narrative and to tell such a complex story with like all these different characters without him feeling like the reader is going to get lost or like he's getting lost in the storyline of the plot because there could have been a version of this book that was just plot focused and it would have been a lot
Hmm.
less like holding of the reader.
Yeah, I definitely find it interesting because it is set from Dylan's perspective and the different obstacles he's coming across, not just with Antonio and Elliot, but also with the predators. And there is a scene that I actually liked where he's borrowing auric energy from Elliot. Um, and not to spoil anything, but it kind of resolves itself in its own way, but it's kind of shows how he's almost afraid of his own power, or he doesn't know his own strength, I think is a better way to put it. But yeah, I really enjoyed kind of in a weird way identifying with Dylan as the protagonist because he kind of still is a fish out of water. He has only been an immortal for so long that he was aware of it. Um, there's a moment where Dylan is enchanted by Elliot. Um, were you aware of the implications when you wrote that passage?
So like the first conversation where Elliot comes into the story
Hmm.
when he's on stage, that's like the first moment we kind of meet him. And Dylan's like, yeah, he knew this guy was world famous pop star. Like, obviously, he's pretty attractive. He like listened to his music in the past, and there's even like a song that plays in the car in book one that is by Elliot. And so it's kind of like in that moment, it's like oh my God, I just met like an idol, or like I just saw this person for the first time who like only existed kind of in fantasies, you know?
Hmm.
Um, and then so in that moment, because Elliot's performing, there's a lot of his energy kind of out and like influencing the crowd. But then when they go backstage is when what I really didn't know was going to happen. Because Elliot has this interaction with Solomon Gabriel, and he's disappointed in how the show went. Um, and then that's like the first instance where we get a sense of his personality. Um, and then Dylan and Antonio have to kind of like abduct him. So there could have been like an abduction scene, but I felt it more interesting because of how Elliot was behaving for them to kind of like allow him to manipulate himself because he kind of like sets the tone for his perspective of who these people are. And from that moment on is kind of like how I saw Elliot in general. And that interaction drove his behavior for the rest of the book. And that really is like letting these characters kind of be themselves and to drive their own narratives and to let their, like, in the writing perspective, we always want to know what the characters want. So let their wants drive the plot and the storyline. Um, because that is what's going to feel the most natural. If you kind of like push these characters into scenarios without there being like logic or reason behind it. And like that's, the philosopher side of me, I guess. Um, because there has to be a reason for everything. So let the reader follow that logic. Um, but yeah, so his personality kind of drives how they carry out that abduction. Um, and it becomes very entertaining for the reader because Elliot doesn't really know what's going on. The reader does know what's going on because he's they're in Dylan's head, and then they're automatically like this new character shifts the dynamic between Dylan and Antonio after this beautiful like lovey-dovey scene that we had in Malaga. So it creates like these deep contrasts between what's going on, what the reader knows is going on, and then what some of the characters feel like is going on.
Yeah, he definitely gives himbo energy, Elliot.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, is there a particular scene or passage you're proud of? Because my favorite scene is probably the last battle where Dylan is singing and he has the lyrics that kind of reflect how he's feeling in the moment. What was your favorite passage?
Yeah. The well, you said Dylan, but I think Elliot was singing like
Oh,
Above Your
yes.
Water, right? Yeah.
Elliot, sorry. My brain.
Yeah. So that was obviously like the hardest scene I ever wrote. Um, just based on everything that was happening at once and the amount of characters that were there and the amount of storylines that collided really. Um, because all of these different characters have their own vendettas, have their own unique like strengths against certain other characters. And like there's a sense that, like me maybe pretending I'm Aurelius wants to orchestrate this battle in the most efficient way. But there's three cruise ships coming in, to this cove where thousands of people are like on beaches, on cliff sides, ready to watch the biggest show in like Mediterranean history. And Elliot's supposed to perform like from one of the cruise ships. Um, and not only just Elliot, Geordie impersonating Elliot. So it's like, how do I do this with also staying in Dylan's head and keeping the chapter central to Dylan's struggles and having a resolution for every character who has an opportunity to have a resolution while also showing these fantastic aura magic battles. And then I knew I wanted to incorporate the song too. So, like, we don't know it as readers, but Elliot's also like writing this song while he's on his Mediterranean journey with these immortals and like going from port to port trying to save his concert as Geordie's his supposed like best friend is like impersonating him and like capturing the fans and having them be enchanted to get onto the cruise ships and kind of be these little minions that they can control um for the purpose of, you know, being workers back in Malaga, but also as like auric batteries for them to like use to pull energy from and like, you know, kill in the process of doing that, like suck all the energy out of them pretty much. Um, and then like the stakes felt real. That was the easy part, like building the story and the plot into stakes that felt real, where Dylan's um stakes feel real for him are in, you know, being able to help Elliot, being impacted by Elliot's like inspiring performance after he like hijacks the show himself, learning something from his lyrics, but also Dylan has to, he's been trying to learn this kind of, he's been trying to understand what he did power wise in book one and use that to his advantage in book two as a tool rather than just like something he kind of is able to do because of his purity and his intention. Um, and then also do that without failing at a time when he's never done it before, like it's his first time. Um, kind of having to be conscious of using this power. Um, and then reminding him of his limitations. So it took a long time. That scene in particular took the most uh revisions, the most rereading, the most revisions, the most kind of thought in terms of like how do I transition this scene to not just be like, oh, at the end everything's great, but also like to keep the stakes going and getting increasingly more real and more dangerous. Um, and then connecting everything that happened throughout the book to be also present there. Um, I think having such such a dynamic story throughout the book made it easier because I had all these things that I could kind of like say, okay, this is happening over here, this is happening over here. And then also time, like they don't have time forever. You can only focus on so many different things at once. So allowing time to kind of guide and the natural speed of like movements and fights and stuff to move the story to the place where it eventually gets, um, with also having that plot twist aspect of where, figures that were kind of like omniscient throughout the book kind of come into play. Um, and then having, knowing what each character wants is fighting for, and then also knowing what the predators are fighting for and doing throughout the book. Like the immortals don't know kind of what's going on with the predators throughout the book. They only get the snippets of where they're actually present with them.
Hmm.
Um, but I had to know. So really setting in my own mind what these predator characters are doing, what they want, who they are, understanding them, their fight styles, who they would more likely go up against too, like based on the personal vendettas, and like giving the characters those historical kind of histories, because we learn throughout like some of the characters like Cleo Selene and um like Julius Caesar have like this secret history um that kind of connects them. Even if I, went back in time and like made some changes to how Caesar might have like died or not, um to make him a villain in her first life, in addition to being a villain still in her immortal life, and having, a lot of that different dynamic between all the different characters made everything feel like okay, there can be a resolution for Dylan. There can be resolutions for all these different characters, and let me incorporate all of them, and that will help there be enough content for all of the all of the different angles of the story to come together and feel satisfying for the reader, because that's ultimately like what made me, or what was on my mind as I'm writing it. How is this going to feel satisfying for the reader? Um, and while also then like stunning them at the end too.
How has your writing evolved since your first book that you've noticed?
Well, for my first book, I was afraid of having tens of characters to think about. It was a very small cast. Um, there were only like, especially with like dialogue, um, 7 main characters really. Um, and it was in one location in Ocean City. Well, a little bit in New York. He goes to like LBI, Long Beach Island, in a dream, or in a,
Astral projection?
right, because he like he can go through time in his mind, in his aura. He could like use his aura to like go through time, and like a little bit of his connection with Joshua brought him to a memory of Joshua's like previous body. Um, and it kind of showed Dylan what was kind of at stake for himself, and like what like the back history between like what's going on now, behind like what's going on now in book one. Um, and then even like I only bring in Aurelius towards the end. So in book one, I was really trying to figure out, or it's really like Dylan wanting to like start his new life, not knowing he's immortal, but then like the villain comes in, and like the immortal philosophers come in with like these different motives. Like the immortals want to help him, save him, keep him safe because they know about the predator. Dylan doesn't know the extent of, what Joshua's goals are. Um, so my writing has changed in the way that I feel like like what I learned in book one was how to really know a character, how to let the character drive the narrative. What I challenged myself with book two was maintaining that sense of character driven narrative into kind of like a Mediterranean epic with dozens of characters and balancing that. I would say that's like the biggest change in not being afraid to have many different characters, um, with all of their different motives and like a lot of that being driven by dialogue. Um, whereas like in book one, I was kind of, it was a lot like in Dylan's head, because it was more of like a closer, internal struggle for him. Um, yeah, I would say like that's kind of like the biggest change in my writing, while also kind of maintaining that poetic dream and like the narrative dream of visualization throughout the book. Um, yeah, I wouldn't say like drastic changes, but just implementation of more skills and craft, um, tools being used in book two. And then book
Yeah,
three, like maintaining that back in a book that is set in one city, where the stakes need to feel as high and the chapters can't feel redundant. Um, and that the overthrowing of like a fascist city, like a fallen city, needs to feel satisfying for Dylan and the reader without Dylan's story being a side plot. It needs to be the main driver of the story. So, um, it's kind of like playing an accordion. Like, we started really like close and small. We expanded to like this big epic, and then we're bringing it back for book three into like, a smaller setting, I guess, but keeping that broad like meta, perspective and like stakes, the meta stakes for like the world.
yeah. The first book definitely felt more personable, whereas the second book feels a lot more global, like on a global scale, the what's at stake and how Dylan navigates through that, through being through being helped by the other immortal philosophers. Um, for new writers, any advice for new writers that you could give or pass on?
Yeah, start small. Like I know a lot of writers like love the idea of like writing like an epic fantasy and like having that be like their first project, like creating this whole like fantasy world, which is great and like which is aspiring, but the real strength of narrative craft is going to come from what you can do with a character in almost like a single setting. Like with, and that was like if I hadn't started Dylan's story at the bungalow, because that's where it originally started. Or actually, it started at the coffee shop. Like that was the first chapter I wrote at the coffee shop. The bungalow scene where he, makes it to Ocean City came after, but I put it as chapter one because it was, it allowed me to give the reader a setting that isn't just kind of like any other beach town in a way. It allowed me to really set the story from Dylan's perspective of his wants, rather than having him be in a cafe with Antonio and be like, "Oh, like you're really cute. I like you. I'd like to get to know you more." That's great. Um, but it also takes away from like, why is Dylan here in the first place? Um, is he here just to meet Antonio and like be saved by the immortals? No. He's here because he wants to be a great book cover designer. He got a job. This is like a house that was offered to him to stay at and rent for a little bit. He wanted to get away from his toxic friends from Manhattan, and he needed space. And like this is the space that he feels like is suitable for his transformation into understanding himself, into giving himself the opportunity to feel free and liberated. And then with that, he has the capacity to maybe find a romantic relationship. Um, and I wanted to give that because, like, as a queer person, you can't understand who you are if you are in a place where you can't be that person. So he can't be himself or understand himself or know who he is around these toxic homophobic friends. He has to take a step back, be in a place where he can feel free, where he can explore his thoughts, where he can transform almost. Um, he goes to the coffee shop, sees a path forward for becoming or for being able to explore that side of himself. Um, and then we go back to the bungalow for like 2 chapters because he goes through different coping things that he was using, um, in his old life in a way. Like he has the escape of like a joint one night. And but we don't see that again throughout that story or like in book 2 or anything else because he frees himself from like the need to escape based on the living of his own life. And like I like the fact that Antonio is like helpful and the immortal philosophers are helpful in helping him pursue his own life, but it's really his journey. So I would say like for a new writer, understand that journey for your character. Um, tie the narrative directly to the transformations that the character is going to be having because that is what is going to keep readers interested in epic fantasy or a journey across, you know, the Middle Kingdom or whatever. I don't know. If the character never changes, that's where readers feel it's boring, and that's where they want to put it down. Um, because the stakes just don't feel close to the main narrative. Um, so like understand what's at stake, understand where the character wants to get, and then make the plot reflect the difficulties that the character is going to have to work through to get to where they want to be, even if the plot takes them in a whole different direction. Um, because if I hadn't started that story, book 1, as kind of like a literary fiction, it would have never become the fantasy, the urban fantasy that it is. There was a decision that I made like around chapter 4 of like, do I want it to have some fantasy elements or do I want it to just be a literary fiction? But the fact that it kind of had 2 avenues showed that, these first 4 chapters are strong, no matter where I take it. Because I know what the character wants. I know who he is before we even get there. So yeah, like understand the character, read different craft theory, um, analysis, and like tools and tips because knowing what to do with every sentence is going to make every paragraph feel like it needs to be read and um and make every chapter anticipated to the point where the readers are picking the book back up and like planning like, oh, okay, I'll get to read later tonight. I'll be excited. And keep that narrative voice in their head throughout the day, because they're just enthralled with how this character is like telling this story.
Well, book two is really well written, so if you guys have read the first book, definitely get the second book because his imagination is just so good. And I would have trouble keeping track of all those characters if I had to write them myself. So, applause to you. Thank you so much
Thank
for,
you. Yeah. It's also like in our previous interview, we talked about doing research. So
yeah.
the only reason I was able to kind of write these characters and like step into their shoes, a lot of the historical ones, is because I have read them. I read their words. I can understand how their brains work, um, like in terms of reason and logic, and in terms of like history and contradiction. Also, like all the queer characters aren't saints. Some of them are the predators too, where it's like you were so right on some things, but like you're also like so wrong on some others to like show like, you know, a broad spectrum of reality. Um, and that's like a truth of the human condition. And that's like another thing, like speak to the character's truth, with every sentence and every paragraph and every chapter, illuminate something about the societal truth, and then illuminate something about the human condition in general. And if you always have those three things in mind, along with everything else that I mentioned, um, the reading will feel impactful.
Well, it definitely is. It left an impression for sure. Well, thank you so much. And that concludes our interview.
Yeah. So everyone can find the book. It's of course it's on Amazon and you can order it from any small bookstore or like places like Barnes and Noble and places like that. We have our bookshop link down below with our list of all the LGBTQ author books from our interview series and some other ones that we haven't yet been able to interview. And then yeah, follow us, Four Elements Press, at Four Elements Press on socials. My user is at Alexander Casillas Author. And then subscribe to the YouTube channel, give it a like. And Angelica Martinez is also on socials at Angie the Writer. Or
Yes.
yeah, Angie the Writer. And um we have more upcoming things, the LGBTQ author uh short story series where we'll both be featured. Um, I'm editing that now as we speak, getting it ready for publication. And then Angie has another book on the way, or two,
Yeah.
at least for the near future. My third book is going to be upcoming next year, probably, hopefully. Um, we're getting there. We're about like halfway through maybe in writing.
Yay.
Yeah. But yeah, it's been great talking with you and allowing readers to kind of get behind the scenes, allowing writers to get a few takeaways, and always that's who we're writing for. So we're always writing for the reader, And that's another key piece of advice is like, you know, things can be great for your journals, can be great for your diaries, but the reader and the reader's fulfillment and satisfaction with what's being written needs to be top of mind in terms of like, whatever genre you're writing in, because there's expectations that the readers are going to have, in the same way that our audience is expecting, um, some different videos or content from us in terms of the interview series. So, yeah, follow us along. We're always speaking to you, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.